would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. In Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Hey, Housers and listeners of On the Way Home. I'm your host, Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening or watching if you're watching the video segment of this. So excited about today's episode. Very, very cool. We have two really great guests and talking about a very important topic. Before we get to that, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, our partner in producing On the Way Home. Lots of great things happening at the Alliance. They are the voice of this sector, one of the big voices in the ear of government, helping push agendas forward that will prevent and end homelessness across the country. They did just announce as well that registration for the conference in the fall for Halifax has opened. So register for that. They have incredible speakers, incredible presentations, bringing together thousands of people. And that's, to me, I love the presentations. I learned so much, but also the networking that happens and the connections with people at these conferences are so valuable. So sign up for that. Check that out. Go online to caeh.ca. Find out all about that, and as well all the other great work that they are doing at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. As well, my organization, Blue Door, continues to push forward in the battle to prevent and end homelessness. We do our work currently across York, Durham, and Peel. We do a lot of work with emergency housing, transitional housing, and long-term housing for seniors, for men, for families, for youth, for 2S LGBTQ plus youth. We do work with, we have a construction social enterprise called Construct, which is so cool. It's homelessness prevention in action, because if people have jobs in the trades that pay really well and mean a lot, they will, if they're homeless, experiencing homelessness, it will be short-lived. And if they're not, this gives them the income to actually afford to live on their own. Very cool. And guess what? We need hundreds of thousands of people in the trades to build those millions of homes that we need for the future. And they are going to do that. Super cool. Win-win-win with that Construct program. If your community, you're saying Construct sounds like a pretty cool program. If you're interested in talking with Blue Door more about Construct and maybe having Construct in your community, you can reach me at michael.b@bluedoor.ca and check out the program and all the other great stuff that Blue Door is doing at bluedoor.ca. Now let's talk about today's episode. I really enjoyed this episode. I had with me Shannon Downs from the Waterloo Community Legal Clinic and John Fox from Robins Appleby, who's both of which they've both been on the podcast before. Shannon talking about their work with eviction prevention and working with landlords in Waterloo, and John, of course, multiple times. We talked about Bill 23 and other things that are happening. But today we wanted to talk about the landmark decision that early in 2023, there was a landmark decision around the region of Waterloo was ruled against, and they could not evict people from living in tents on their land, on the public land. That was at 100 Victoria Street, because the shelter system didn't have enough beds. And they went as far in the 51-page decision to talk about choice. And it wasn't just enough to have any old space for people. It was really about choice for people, and that they had to have a variety of different choices and work to do that. And that was huge, right? And it wasn't just about Waterloo. Now that this was law, every municipality across Ontario, around Canada, was seeing this decision and having to react to it. So John, Shannon, and I, we talk about that. We talk about how this all came about. It's a bit of a kind of a David and Goliath situation too, where you have a small community clinic having to actually go to the Ontario Superior Court and work this through. Not something they normally do. They were surprised to win. Very happy, but surprised to win. And really what that means for all sorts of municipalities now scrambling to say, what does that mean for me? What do we do? What are the legal implications around it? And we hope this is a positive thing that, Shannon, in this interview that we talk about, or in this podcast, we'll talk a little bit more. And she's saying, yes, we don't want to invest where encampments are the answer, but also that doesn't mean we can't take some actions to make encampments better and make them safer and healthier for people as well. So a broad variety of topics we covered during this conversation, but it all revolves around this landmark decision. I hope you enjoy it. I certainly did. Let's take a listen. John and Shannon, so amazing to have you here again on the way home. I'm so excited about today's topic that we're going to get into because for the last few months, it's so much of what people have been talking about in the sector. And we've got two experts. So really, really cool. But before we get into that, we do have a standard question that we ask everyone. And Shannon, I'll start with you. And that is, what does home mean to you?
Home means to me, what does home mean to me? It means stability, comfort, safety, familiarity.
Very cool. Yes. And well said. And listen, I think that's the fewest number of words anyone's ever used. So
very
one
concise.
of the best points. You got there quick. Thank you. John?
Oh, I'm going to change my usual answer because this is my third time on the show. And I will say that home is where my family is.
Oh, and even fewer words at both. All those words you used, Shannon, like stability, and John, family, that is it. And I think that's when a few years back, when there was an Indigenous definition of homelessness, that's what they're saying. It was too much about the actual physical structure sometimes. And for Indigenous people, they were saying it's about the land, it's about relationships and connection, right? And I think those transfer over quite well. Now, listen, although you're both repeat guests, maybe we have some first-time listeners who are like, who are these individuals and why are they here? So if you just talk a little bit about your journey into this work so people know who Shannon Downs and John Fox are. Shannon, we'll start with you again.
Okay, so I'm a lawyer and I'm the executive director at Waterloo Region Community Legal Services, which is a community legal aid clinic located in Kitchener-Waterloo. So I've been at the clinic for about 10 years, working in the area of poverty law, helping people with issues like homelessness and housing, specifically eviction prevention. And we do a lot of work with folks who are receiving social assistance, who may have disabilities, mental health disorders, substance abuse disorders, and helping them to either maintain their income or maintain their housing. Prior to that, I was in private practice as a lawyer doing employment litigation, and I got into the area of consent and capacity advocacy and mental health advocacy, and that was sort of my segue, I guess, from the world of private practice into the legal aid world. So that's how I ended up ultimately at the clinic.
Very cool. Yeah, it makes total sense. Thanks for that. How about you, Mr. Fox?
Well, I'm a lawyer as well. I spent 7 years at Toronto Community Housing as a lawyer and as its VP of development, and then went back into private practice and worked with nonprofits and co-ops and sector agencies, mostly on development work. So those two experiences as a public sector lawyer and as a real estate lawyer are influence how I see the case we're going to talk about today. And so I'm really, really keen to get into the discussion, Michael.
Very cool. Love both of the journeys. And yeah, so let's talk about today's discussion. In early 2023, and there was a lot of pre-work before that happened, but the Ontario Superior Court of Justice decision came down where else? In the region of Waterloo. And it said the region of Waterloo isn't allowed to evict people living in tents on one of its vacant lots at 100 Victoria Street because its shelter system did not have enough beds for people experiencing homelessness. So there's this 51-page decision where this justice said clearing encampments without sufficient shelter spaces would infringe on their constitutional rights. Shannon, I was hoping that you could add some more commentary and color around how this decision came to be, because I did a terrible job at it. Or in layperson's terms, what does this, and afterwards, what does this mean?
Sure. Well, I can start with just a bit of the background. So the encampment in question became quite prominent last spring. So I believe the people had first started living in it sometime in December of 2021, and in the spring of 2022, it started to grow to the point where there was at one point, I believe, around 70 people living at the encampment. The region of Waterloo posted an eviction notice at the beginning of June, letting people know that they would have to be out of the encampment by the end of June. And when that didn't happen, the region decided to file an application with Superior Court to ask the court to issue orders for the eviction. So they were proceeding under a section of the Municipal Act, Section 440. We don't have to really get into details about that. But at that time, we were already involved in assisting people at the encampment. And the region actually reached out to us and said, if people need representation, would your clinic be willing to represent them? And it, we weren't 100% on board with that at first, because most of our law practice is before administrative tribunals, not at the Superior Court level, which is, a significantly more intensive type of litigation than tribunal work. So, yeah, at that point we decided, yes, we will get involved. Yes, we will represent the people at the encampment. We started working with them. So that's sort of the background. And then the hearing took place in November. It was 3 days of argument by lawyers, because it went by way of application, meaning that most of the evidence went in paper form, in affidavit form. And then when we got the decision in January, the court decided that the proposed eviction by the region of the people living at the encampment would violate their Section 7 charter rights. So that's the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. We had made both Section 7 arguments and Section 15 arguments, which is Section 15 is the equality section of the charter. We weren't successful on the Section 15 equality arguments, essentially where we were arguing that the proposed eviction would have a disproportionately significant impact on certain subgroups of people living at the encampment, mainly women, trans folks, and Indigenous people. The court did not accept those arguments, but they did find that the Section 7 rights were violated. So essentially it meant that the region was not able to go ahead with the eviction. And there are still people living there at the encampment as of today.
Well, and thank you for that. I mean, I've got to ask, were you confident going in that this was going to be the decision, or no, not at all?
No, I would say the opposite. When we initially took on the case, like I said, we don't have a lot of experience arguing. Like, I had some background arguing before Superior Court in private practice, but the clinic itself, the work that we do, tends to be at the administrative tribunal level. So, we don't really have a lot of the supports built into our working environment to do that kind of work. And we felt that we were sort of significantly under-resourced, and the timelines were extremely tight. So the region was pushing hard for a very quick hearing in this matter. So, the application was served at the beginning of July, and it ultimately was heard in November. And in that time, we filed 1,500 pages of a record, which was our clients' affidavits, lay person affidavits, expert affidavits, there was a whole lot of work that went into getting everything ready in that short time frame. And I don't think we didn't really know what we were doing when we first started. And I think we thought in our minds, well, it's important that their voices, the people living at the encampment, that their voices are heard in the court process. So, even making sure that we make that happen is a win. That the delay would be beneficial for people. So it would give them some time to, if they were going to try and find housing or alternative accommodation or go into shelter, it would buy them some time. So we thought that would be helpful. But did we think we were going to win? No, we didn't. I think we felt that the existing case law in Ontario was kind of against us. There were some helpful cases from British Columbia, but we certainly felt that the odds were not in our favor.
It was a bit of David and Goliath too. When I think of a region of Waterloo would have a little bit more in the resource department than a community legal clinic too, right? So that it is truly amazing. John, let's talk about the legal implications of this, and why was it not appealed? And of course, Shannon, you can add as well. But this is, yes, it affected this decision in Waterloo, but it's much broader than that.
Well, for sure. But first, let me say, I don't know where you were at when you started this, Shannon, but you ended right, and that's what really counts. So congratulations. Shannon was there the whole time, whereas I, like a lot of people, sort of learn about this from the news when it actually happens, and unlike other people, then sort of dig into it and actually read the case. And when you first look at it, you think 50 pages is long, but then you hear Shannon talk about 1,500 pages, and you're like, well, that's a pretty good bargain for my reading. I think it's a really important case in several respects, and I want to start with one thing I found unusual about it when comparing reading to other case law that one reads, particularly as a real estate lawyer, and that's the extent to which the judge actually goes and talks about the lives of the people in front of him. And there's a real humanity to that and a real warmth. What's kind of funny is when I've been talking about it with other lawyers, I've come across a couple people who knew Mr. Justice Valenti as a lawyer and insisted on telling me that he's not a particularly, I shouldn't think of him as a particularly liberal guy. And yet, and when you read the case is driven by the application of logic to the law in Canada today. He does make judgment choices along the way, but he comes out with this decision, which is now law in Canada. It's now law in Ontario. When I think about people who talk about it, there's also a lot of talk in housing advocacy circles. And because of the nature of municipal commentators, you won't really hear municipal in-house lawyers going and saying this, what they think the implications of the decision might be, but there's clearly significant implications on municipalities. And so when you sort of think about it in terms of the housing system, which you and I have talked about on this show before, Michael, one of the messages here, there's a real sort of shock to the system that comes out of this, because where there's pressure in the municipality to deal with an encampment, there's now pressure back through this case to say, well, what are you doing to create long-term solutions? And one of the things that's really remarkable about it is the long-term solution is actually easier to identify than the short-term solution here. So because it takes time to generate housing, and it even takes time to generate additional shelter options.
Absolutely. Shannon, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're grappling here in the region with the short-term and the long-term implications right now, because like I said, the encampment still exists. It's one of many encampments that exist in Kitchener-Waterloo, on other pieces of public property. So it's not unique. It's the only one that was part of the case, but certainly I think the region is obviously restrained in what they can do with the other encampments that exist in a region because of the decision. But I don't think the region's intentions in terms of trying to voluntarily move people off the property at this point haven't really changed. And we're seeing them we're seeing that the region is trying to come up with some short-term solutions. So we actually have a managed, what they're calling a hybrid shelter, outdoor shelter being built, which is small, sort of tiny cabins and a central kitchen, bathroom facility that will be staffed by people, and there'll be services and things like that. So that's a new interim housing project that the region's come up with since this case sort of has been working its way through the courts. So, one of the things that became apparent to me that as we were developing our arguments about both the accessibility of shelter beds in the region and the number of shelter beds, as those arguments were being developed, there was a lot of movement in the region's housing department to come up with new housing solutions as the case was going on. Because I think at that point they could sort of see that the writing was on the wall. We were talking about, we have a point in time count from September 2021 that said we have, approximately 1,100 people who are unhoused. And at the time of when the materials were filed, I believe the region had around 400 shelter beds, and that included, beds that were strictly to be used for youth purposes, so no one over 25 would be able to get access those beds. Some COVID beds, things like that. So there was a big gap between the number of unhoused people and the number of shelter beds, and the region immediately started to try and to narrow that gap. And I don't know that that's necessarily the right answer in the long term. I think, what we heard from our clients was that a lot of them had been in shelter, had been in and out of shelter multiple times. A lot of the people who are at the encampment have been chronically unhoused for months or years. And so, they weren't interested in going back into shelter. That's why they were at the encampment living in a tent. They were looking for something that provided them with what they felt was more stability, more autonomy, more control over their surroundings. So it's a, I think it's a difficult issue that every municipality across Ontario is grappling with right now. How do we get enough housing built quickly enough to address the growing homelessness problem that we have in the province and in the country?
And as well as the different types of options, right? I think quite often too. All right, so people will read headlines and they'll demonize municipalities, regions, and say, that they're just mean people. They're bringing in the police. They're clearing these things out. And what they don't know in the background is it's been months of outreach workers and others going in, chatting. There comes a time where they're saying, all right, we've done all this. At some point, this is a public space that we're trying to, and so they clear it out. But it is around options to say, hey, we've got a bunch of spaces, but what the clients are saying, I don't feel comfortable going to a shelter. I was hurt. I had a bad experience. My stuff got taken. So it is about options. Or the option you're asking me is, way across town. I don't know anyone there. My doctor's across here. So we have to try to provide various different options, and that doesn't happen overnight. So it's a very tricky situation. Now, I have a question for the two of you around. This is public space, right? Public land. If an encampment is on private land owned by a developer, same rules apply, or not so much?
No. So the short answer is no. The same rules don't apply. So the charter only applies to government action. So a private landowner posting a notice, a trespass notice, would not be covered or would not be affected by the charter arguments.
It's good to know. And here's why I asked that question. So the reverb of this decision too, of course, had people all across the country saying, okay, what do we do? How's this going to affect our region? Where my organization, Blue Door, is situated in the York region. Most of the encampments are actually on private land. In fact, right next to our men's emergency housing program, there's the land next door. So what happens at Blue Door, if there's no space, or if you're something happens and you can't stay at Blue Door anymore, your options are outside of the region, Peel or Toronto, and many won't do that. They won't travel. They walk about 100 feet to the encampment next door on the land. And that developer has said, I'm not going to develop that land for a long time. Not really a concern. I really don't want to make anything of it. So it remains right in the region. And saying, well, if that developer's okay with it, the police, I mean, they haven't asked us to do anything. So these encampments go. Now, the other piece to this, and I think that people celebrated this, and it's something to be celebrated, is great, and it kind of pushes us to do more. But what we don't want to come out of this too is that we just need better encampments, right? Like, do you know what I mean? We want the message to be we need better housing options, and encampments are not necessarily part of that broader solution. But let's not shut those down until we have those other options. Is that, what are your thoughts around that? That makes me a little nervous because it's around the better sleeping bag or a better tent as being a solution instead of housing. And we don't want the general public to start celebrating that.
You go ahead, John.
I want to say I want to answer two questions there, actually, because there's some of the stuff you said before. I was hoping to comment on, Michael, relating to property rights and stuff like that, because after all, I am a real estate lawyer, so it's hard for me not to notice that stuff. So two things. First, like, one of the implications of the case for municipalities, to my mind, is the ability to deal with their land in a way that they're used to. So, for example, if we took that land, which is not a park and not a dedicated highway, and the municipality says, I'm going to sell the land to private interest in order to even generate money to build a shelter, on the strength of that case, I'd say a pretty good case to stop that sale, because you know the intent of what's going to happen. And so there is a potential restriction on how municipalities deal with their property. The private person doesn't have the same issue because the charter doesn't apply, and as Shannon said, and probably the Human Rights Code, which does apply to a private actor, you'd have more challenge with, because the equality argument under Section 15, which is the more analogous argument to the Human Rights Code, didn't fly in that particular case. But I can tell you that I'm pretty sure the developer you're talking about hasn't talked to their own lawyer about their own liabilities for the things that are happening on that land. And so when we're talking about, the message should not be. By the way, I think there's really broad agreement on this, certainly in the housing sector, that and the people I've talked to, is the message should be, we need to worry a lot about better housing options, particularly supportive housing options, where people are getting help in the context of their own housing, and then potentially moving along a curve to more permanent independent living and so on, where it's possible. Because in the back of our minds, Shannon was talking about, this is not the only place in Ontario, that's true, but it is definitely not the only place in the world. And the Americans are seeing encampments where after a while it's a major impact on the surrounding communities, both individuals who are living near the encampments, and also businesses that are or were near the encampments. And those are things which will play on the minds of municipalities. So when you're looking at this as a municipality, you're like, okay, I can't build it fast enough. So a lot of and for that matter, they probably can't afford to build it, even if I could build it fast enough. So you need help from senior levels of government, which is why I said there's a real shock to the housing system that comes out of this. So those interim measures become really critical. And you mentioned one thing which I think is like an unanswered question for me. If Kitchener goes, the campus says, I now have a family of two, and I can shelter you together, but that shelter is in London. Do you have the right to say no? And if you say no, is there a change? I'm interested in Shannon's view on this, but is there a change in the nature of your rights? And because to a certain extent, the case says the bylaw is unconstitutional until you've done these things, and then it says you can come back. But in a sense, it's like it's unconstitutional until it's not. So those are the things that are play on my mind quite a bit. And I appreciate that I get to play armchair lawyer here, because I wasn't there. And so Shannon gets to be the cool lawyer between the two of us, because she was there. So I'd be really interested in hearing her thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of things that I want to address. Like, I agree with Michael that more encampments or encampments are not an ideal solution for homelessness, right? Like, obviously, in a country like Canada, people should not have to be spending winter in Canada living in a tent. It's a terrible a terrible thing to have to endure. So, but our case really says, like, when someone doesn't have an option, like when they don't have a choice, and I'll talk a little bit about what choice means, and that idea of, how the court dealt with that, but that the displacement or eviction is really taking someone from a very precarious position and removing them from that into something even worse, right? So there's certainly no, we weren't arguing that this is like an ideal situation that everyone should be allowed to do this forever. We're just saying, just don't, when someone doesn't have somewhere else to go that's a better option, don't force them into a worse option. On the issue of the choice, yeah, I think, one of the things that the judge had to grapple with was the region was saying, on any given night we have, X number of empty beds in the shelter system. So people are choosing, the region framed it as people are choosing to live in a tent, because they don't like the rules in the shelters, or they don't want to have to go to Cambridge if they're in Kitchener, or they don't want to have to make the trek somewhere else. And the judge rejected that. He said that in his view, and when he analyzed that, the people had valid reasons for choosing not to be in shelter. For example, if you had a partner, if you had a pet, and there weren't spaces available for you, or you didn't feel safe, and you had a negative experience in shelter where you had experienced violence or harassment, and you didn't feel safe in a shelter, but you felt safe at the encampment, that those were valid personal choices that people were entitled to make. And in fact, under the charter, we recognize that, like, when you look at the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, the court has said that, when you're looking at liberty and security of the person, that part of the security of the person and liberty is the ability to make personal choices about your living conditions, right? That none of us, like, we all get to do that. Like, I get to choose where I have a lot more economic mobility, so I have a choice where I can live. No one can tell me I have to live in, an apartment, a particular apartment, or that I have to move if I'm able to do that financially. But we seem to have a different sort of, there's often a different narrative when it comes to people living in poverty, that somehow they should have to accept what's offered, um, without, being able to exert some personal autonomy about that.
Shannon, I call that the good enough theory that I find often in this sector, right, where we think, well, this is good enough, and I often, because I've been in the sector a long time, will get sent things about, look at this super cool sleeping bag that turns into a jacket that turns into, and I would say, like, we don't need a better sleeping bag or jacket or a better tent or whatever. We actually need, like, housing, and that's great because people think that's good enough. It, like, saves them, keeps them warm for a night. I understand it. The intentions are good. But as Canadians, I think sometimes we think that's okay, and it's even the out of the colds. We run one of those too, and we were saying it was separate for a long time because that was the end game: cot, food, back outside. And so there was no, like, the end game wasn't good, and now it's kind of wrapped into a system where housing supports are wrapped in. We're seeing some of those long-term people find housing. Interesting too when we talk about options and how long it takes. There was recently an article in the Toronto Star about a gentleman, I think he'd been out for 25 years living in a tent through all the winters, and he finally has said, because of his health issues, I'm ready to go in. And there was a celebration of this, but if you read kind of further down the article, he's on a waiting list now, and they anticipate it will take 4 to 6 years for him to find the housing that, or get the housing that, because he has some health supports that he needs, right? So he could end up dying before he actually gets the support he needs. So it's very tough. We've got to move faster, and we have to have options. And I think everyone's entitled to those options. It's not a one size fits. I think even in the sector as well, and homelessness, for the longest time, we were kind of lumping everyone together with their needs, and then youth would say very different needs. Like, housing for youth looks different. Housing for seniors looks different. Housing for people with developmental disabilities looks a little different. And so there's not a one size fits all around that. I want to talk about what happens from here. So we have this historic, thing happen. People are scrambling a little bit. Municipalities are saying, what does that mean for me? what happens from here? Like what's happening next? What do you think the ramifications long term are around this? Shannon, we'll start with you and then go to John.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my hope is that what happens next is that we have some really serious conversations, like John said, at all levels of government, like higher levels of government, the provincial government, the federal government, about how dire the situation is in communities in Ontario and across the country. That people, when they're, we see it on a daily basis when our clients get evicted from their rental housing because they have arrears or, landlord's own use applications or N13 rent evictions. They don't have options. And, we say to people, are you on the housing list? Yeah, I've been on it for years. I'm like at number 5,000 on the list. So I think that, maybe some of the solutions that used to work in the past that were serving the community just aren't working anymore because the depth of homelessness is so much worse. So, I think we have to, I think that, I don't have all the answers, but I just know that we have to do something different than what we're doing right now. I don't think necessarily more shelter beds is the answer. Maybe more interim housing options where people have that supported piece, and there's some interim housing until we can find them more permanent housing. Something along those lines is the answer. But I think what's happening, like John said, is there's a lot of conversations happening within municipalities about what to do. I was just in Kingston, Ontario, and they have a fairly large encampment in the city core, that they were proposing to evict. And the paper ran a story about our case on the front page. And now they're not evicting at this moment. I think they've held off on their eviction action, and they're talking to the legal representatives who are advocating on behalf of the people living in the encampment right there, and trying to come up with some sort of solution. Like, is there a protocol that they could develop where they, commit to working with people to try and voluntarily find them other places to live if that encampment is unsafe and needs to be cleared? But I also think if you read the decision, there's some interesting stuff about mitigation, right? Like what municipalities can do to mitigate the risks in an encampment by helping people, make sure that they don't have fire hazards in their tent, that they have bathroom facilities, that there are pest control measures being taken place. So I think there's also those types of issues that municipalities don't. It doesn't have to be either we're evicting or we're ignoring you. There's a middle ground there where you're supporting people.
Yeah, I think if you don't have an encampment in your municipality, you need to close your eyes to pretend that there is one and start working out what you're going to do, so that you have it straight. And I think that means having to grapple with challenging questions like how much of the relocation or sheltering can I do in neighboring communities? Who do I have who can actually engage with people who are on the site? The work that the City of Toronto did through its Ombudsman's office, which is pretty frank stuff on good and not so good interactions in those situations, is kind of mandatory reading if you're developing that kind of policy. And I do think you kind of have to say out loud that, and I know municipalities do say this out loud, but they cannot carry at the municipal level. You cannot solve this problem. So there was a time when we were building housing at a faster pace through more significant public intervention. And I know that we will often hear about, like we was at a seminar on the Housing Accelerator Fund not that long ago, and it's great to put the emphasis on the B when you say $4 billion, but when you divide that up by 100,000 units, it's not it doesn't create a unit on its own. Like you go through those pro formas, and that doesn't cut it. So you're stacking up all kinds of stuff to do it, and the nonprofits and co-ops and private sector guys who are doing it, it's not an easy go. So if there's not if you're not leaning into that, then there won't be the money to deal with this at the end of this housing spectrum that we're talking about today. We have the last time I was on the show, we were talking about the government's efforts through Bill 23, which is largely aimed at a totally different part of the housing spectrum. And so in order to get at any of this, I think we need both the strong policy framework for municipalities to act within, but also real intervention at this level in cash terms to create housing options, which would be different, in which I suspect Michael and the group at Blue Door, for instance, like you'd have a lot of input in how that kind of thing would run. Those are my thoughts.
Well, thank you both. I think, we've been talking about encampments for a long time. Shannon, to your point of that kind of, where's the middle ground, right? Either, and I look even in, I believe in Kitchener-Waterloo, a Better 10th City, who we've had on here as well. That was, to some people, one group celebrating that. Look at what we did. And another group saying that's horrifying. Like, get them housing. Why are you building tiny structures and doing that was on private land, right? That was, and so that was different. And I like having both points. We've had Ian DeYoung on this from Org Code, who's written kind of a book about different ways to kind of tackle and work through. We talked with Eleni Farah, who goes to municipalities and chats with them about different strategies to take when approaching encampments. So there's work out there on how to do this. We had a gentleman from Calgary from the drop-in center there, who they have 900 people in an encampment next door. They worked hand in hand with police and individuals and housed them, and that went fairly smoothly. So there is some there are some good examples and good best practices and those types of things on how to approach this. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention it's not just about housing either. We know just recently the Canadian Alliance End Homelessness, who are a partner in producing this podcast, they pushed really hard in the last federal budget for a housing prevention benefit, and basically incomes, right? And I think in their white paper, they talked about 80 to 85% of people in the shelter system would not be there if they simply had the income to afford the housing that's available. So you're more shelter spaces? No, I think if we actually had the incomes people needed and more affordable housing, absolutely, as countries like Finland have shown, we don't need more shelter spaces, but income plays a big part, and that is a bit of a quicker turnaround than the amount of housing we need. They have to go hand in hand, and unfortunately, that didn't happen in this budget. But absolutely, I think there's a lot of questions that come out of this, and there are a lot of resources out there to help communities through this, and they're going to need them.
I think that's a great point, the income part, because we certainly saw that with CERB, that CERB prevented a lot of people from losing their housing during COVID. So adequate income makes a huge difference. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that has really been jumping out at me recently is just the lack, the number of actual purpose-built rentals that we have in the region is shrinking. So we're seeing, there's certainly lots of development and building going on, but not a lot of it is purpose-built rentals. And the purpose-built rentals that are in our region, we're getting a lot of them are older stock. So then we end up seeing renovictions and sometimes conversion to condos. So that's, I don't know what the answer is to that, but that certainly is a trend that I think is not helping the situation.
Yeah. Okay. But message there to municipalities as well is it is much cheaper to try and hold on to existing affordable, sort of naturally affordable units, as Steve Palmer likes to call them, than it is to build new. I have a client right now who is involved in doing that, and I think the ask of the municipality is something in the order of $50,000 a door, which is not even close to what it would cost to build new.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, we had an example recently where a residential complex that had been developed using government funding 15 or 20 years ago was coming to the end of its lifespan of the agreement that was in place that the developer had been sold, and then the tenants were all getting asked to sign N11s to move out because they wanted to to repurpose it into condominium dwellings. So yeah, I agree with you. Like, it would be nice if we could stop, if there were some incentives or policies, frameworks in place that would maybe prevent that from happening. Because when we see those really good, housing stock getting lost, it's really hard on the community.
I mean, thank you for bringing that up. I've heard numbers like 15-1 crumbling infrastructure lost through the private sector for every new build. There's whole new. Let's build a supply to John's. We got to hang on to what we have, and yours too. And I think they're seeing that a bit. You see some of those funds. Toronto has this mural funding right now that's allowing nonprofits to buy some of those, and that came out of a push through Parkdale, right through that land trust, saying, "Hey, like there's all these buildings around us that we're going to lose, and these community members we're going to lose their housing. Help us to buy that. We need the capital to do it." So you're seeing it a little bit. People are kind of seeing that, but yeah, it's not just about building new, because we're losing too many to the private sector. I think Tim Richter said we have less affordable housing now than we did in 2015. So we're losing ground, even though we're building a lot, and we need to do both, and we need groups like yours, Shannon, in Waterloo, that do incredible work with your eviction prevention program. So people are staying in the homes, because we know much harder to find new homes than and much easier to keep them in the homes they have currently. So yeah, thank you both for coming on. This is incredible. It's so fun to talk about, so interesting, and I think we always try and make this podcast all about awareness and education. You've done that. You've helped us. You've educated me, and hopefully our listeners will get a lot out of this. Because we'll read this, but not really know what are the implications. What does it mean? I think you've done a great job of helping us wrap our heads around that and understand that. Thank you both for the work you do in the sectors. Incredibly impactful and so appreciated.
Thanks,
Thank you
Michael.
very much.
Yes. That was another amazing episode. It was huge. And Shannon is so humble. I mean, to take that on and to win the amount of time she didn't have to prepare, and her small but mighty team, incredible outcome with huge reverb out there for the future of encampments. And for John to come on, and really what I love about John Fox too is he's able to take all the legal talk and really make it understandable for common folk like me and others in the sector. So incredible. I hope you learned something. I certainly did. That's what this podcast is all about. We'll see you next time on The Way Home.